Mithani, Sylvie Lapointe, Vice President, Program and Policies, David Bailey, Chief Plant Health Officer of Canada and Senior Director within the Plant Health and Biosecurity Directorate, and Gordon Henry, National Manager of the Potato and Forestry Section. And with the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, we have Tom Rosser, Assistant Deputy Minister, Market Industry Services Branch. So welcome everyone. Before we do get going, we have a 2-hour time limit. That's as much time as our guests can give us. So they do have a short presentation for us, and then we'll jump right into questions. Can I have a motion for the adoption of the agenda? Hannah, thank you very much. Okay, and with that, we will jump into the presentation, so I can hand the floor over to you folks now, and the floor is yours, and we'll hold the questions until the end. That's usually our normal practice, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is Siddika Mithani. I will provide a few opening remarks and then turn it over to Gordon Henry for the presentation. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm addressing you from Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Mr. Chair, thank you for inviting me to address the members of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability. I've been asked to address this committee in English, but I invite members to raise their questions or share their comments in the official language of their choice. On m'a demandé de vous adresser la parole en anglais, mais je tiens à vous assurer que vous pouvez soulever vos questions et avancer vos commentaires dans la langue officielle de votre choix. Before introducing you to those accompanying me today, I would like to impart 3 main sentiments that will hopefully set the tone for today's proceedings. First and foremost, on behalf of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as a whole, I want to convey that we too have felt the deep impact that this situation has had on our colleagues who work on PEI and also live on PEI and are surrounded by friends and family on PEI who are also experiencing the unintended negative consequences as a result of the 2 latest findings of potato wart in October of this year. I'm here, Mr. Chair, to clearly articulate the role of the CFIA in this matter and the work it has been performing since the first detection in 2000 to contain the spread of potato wart and minimize the impact on the trade of the high-quality potatoes produced by Prince Edward Island. There are several facets to the current situation, and it is my hope that our collective testimony before you today will serve to push aside some of the misinformation so that my officials can do the work they need to do to support the eventual resolution of current trade issues. Finally, it is my sincere hope that once today's proceedings draw to a close, I will have convinced members that the Government of Canada is committed to giving this matter the focused attention it deserves. I also hope that there will be a renewed commitment by PEI representatives to work more collaboratively in the pursuit of shared objectives, such as addressing matters related to potato wart findings on PEI, the protection of our plant and food resources, and the sustainability and viability of the potato industry in Canada by mitigating the risks of potato wart spread. To this end, I've invited with me today the following individuals from the CFIA: Sylvie Lapointe, Vice President, Program and Policies Branch; David Bailey, Chief Plant Health Officer of Canada and Executive Director of Plant Health and Biosecurity Directorate; and Gordon Henry, National Manager of the Potato and Forestry Section in the Plant Protection Division. I also requested that Tom Rosser, Assistant Deputy Minister, Market and Industry Services Branch of the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, join me today to answer questions you may have that fall within that mandate. I would like to provide you with assurances that my remarks will be brief so that we can proceed as quickly as possible to addressing the pressing questions the members of this committee will wish to advance. So let me start by stating that CFIA works with stakeholders to develop national farm-level biosecurity standards and producer guidance documents for several crop and animal-based sectors. These standards provide a proactive approach to minimize the introduction and spread of diseases and pests. The development process is supported by CFIA in partnership with the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food under the Growing Forward Agricultural Policy Framework. Biosecurity prevents, minimizes, and controls the introduction and spread of plant pests at the farm level. Pest problems can severely reduce the sustainability and profitability of the Canadian agricultural sector. I will start with the overarching potato wart domestic long-term management plan, which was agreed upon with the United States and was put in place following the first detection in PEI in the year 2000. This plan outlines the minimum survey, testing, and surveillance activities required following a detection. As part of this plan, land restriction controls are put in place on individual fields to restrict the movement of affected potatoes, plants, soil, and other articles that could result in the spread of potato wart outside of the regulated fields. There have been 33 detections in PEI over the last 21 years, including the recent October 2021 detections. Mr. Chair, it is important to note that although the CFIA is restricted in its ability to reveal personal and confidential business information, such as exact locations of the infected fields, the experts here today can still provide general information that points to the significance of the land area masses that these detections compromise. I understand that this is the first time that officials from the United States provided notification that they would cease to accept potatoes from PEI, given that potato wart, or its Latin name, Cinctrium endobioticum, is number 67 on the list of 68 select agents and toxins regulated by the Federal Select Agent Program, jointly comprised of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Division of Select Agents and Toxins, and the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Division of Agriculture Select Agents and Toxins. To be clear, select agents are biological agents and toxins that have been determined to have the potential to pose a severe threat to public health and safety, to animal and plant health, or to animal or plant products. The U.S. Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, indicated that it would therefore seek to impose a federal order, which is a legal document it issues in response to an emergency and or when APHIS considers it necessary to take action to protect agriculture or prevent the entry and establishment into the United States of a pest or disease. Federal orders authorize the Secretary of Agriculture to immediately prohibit or restrict the importation or entry of any plant part, or article if they determine that the prohibition on restriction is necessary to prevent the introduction or dissemination of a plant pest into or within the United States. It is important to note that federal orders remain in effect until they are revised by another federal order or until a regulatory action on the subject is published. With the knowledge of such conditions that would prohibit the CFIA from certifying any potatoes for export from PEI or potentially the rest of Canada, it was deemed necessary to proceed with a voluntary suspension of potato export certification destined from PEI to the US. The CFIA also introduced separate new measures through a ministerial order to restrict the movement of potatoes from PEI to the rest of Canada as a means of preventing the spread of the pest in Canada, demonstrating that Canada has appropriate risk mitigation measures in place to prevent the transmission of potato wart from fresh potatoes outside of infected and regulated fields. The CFIA stands firmly on the science that suggests that any risks of potato wart spread associated with these measures remains negligible. As such, we continue to work closely with our US counterparts at a technical level to address their concerns with a view of minimizing impacts to trade. These discussions include the information APHIS requires to assist with its review of the risk and risk management measures undertaken by the CFIA and PEI for potato wart. Mr. Chair, I encourage members to ask questions about what this process involves if they would like to be provided with a walkthrough of what the boots on ground experience entails. APHIS is seeking clear scientific data demonstrating that the resumption of trade is safe and is looking for assurances that the quarantined area is controlled and does not pose a risk. This includes sharing details of the CFIA's ongoing investigation into potato wart in PEI. Because of the timing of these latest detections, the investigation, which involves the taking of samples from infected fields, started late in the season, but the CFIA provided assurance that it will continue to collect and submit these samples for testing for as long as the weather will allow, which is when the ground freezes. That said, the CFIA is looking into technologies that could possibly be utilized to continue soil sampling as long as possible this winter. Meanwhile, the CFIA laboratory in Charlottetown, which is responsible for the detection of potato wart in samples submitted by CFIA inspectors, is relentlessly analyzing samples that have already been submitted. Mr. Chair, I encourage members to ask questions about what this process involves, if they would like to be provided, again, with a walkthrough of what the boots on ground experience entails. As you will know by now, timelines associated with an investigation such as this depend on a number of factors, and although we are accelerating efforts for sampling and testing, the completion of the investigation is difficult to project, and its accuracy cannot be compromised by expediency for fear of not satisfying the import requirements of a desired market. Mr. Chair, in an effort to keep my remarks as brief as possible, I may have omitted to cover specific items of interest or neglected to provide the desired level of detail. So with that, my colleagues and I remain available to take questions, and we will endeavor to answer them to the best of our abilities. I will now turn over to Gordon to provide you with a short presentation of the investigation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Gordon Henry, and I will just share my screen, which I believe is that document. Can you please confirm if that is visible?
Yeah, that is. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I will proceed here. Okay, I'd like to start off with the biology of the pest. It's really important to understand its behavior and how we mitigate the risk and how we can confirm that our long-term management plan is working. So this deck is really also from a perspective of a risk assessor, and I'm a risk manager, and I fit in that zone between science and the inspectors and trained staff that implement the programs that we develop. So I'm in the program development side. I'm also the lead technical person responsible for the discussions with the United States at a technical level. And I think one of the important points about looking at potato wart, and on the screen you should see to the left a potato plant, is all of the activities with potato wart are actually occurring under the ground. There's other pests that I'll probably refer to, such as the potato cyst nematode, also known as PCN. That particular pest, which is a nematode, attacks the root network. And so the signs and symptoms of that pest will show crop deterioration and perhaps a crop failure when it's in high populations. Potato wart is a fungal pest, and it attacks the potato tubers, the storage area of the potato plant. And what can be very discouraging for a farmer who finds this in his field is that the crop can look fabulous. It could look like very well taking care of crop, and it isn't until the potatoes are harvested that the discovery of potato wort occurs. And just a brief history. Now, potato wort, we believe, originated from South America. Sometime in the 1800s, it was introduced into Europe, and it was known to have been found in the United Kingdom and Scotland. And the first and the earliest record that I have where the disease and the fungus are actually described is probably about 1896. And by that time, it had become well established in parts of Europe, to the point that legal trade between Europe and Canada, as well as the United States and other Commonwealth countries, actually was banned in 1912. So we have a long history in dealing with this pest, and this pest is known as a quarantine pest because it has those special characteristics. You can't just manage it out of your farm or out of your soil. It has very persistent qualities, and it is very difficult to detect. So any management plan aimed to target and control potato wort is based on a myriad of different mitigation measures, and I'll be going through a lot of those on this presentation. So the first time we had found potato wort was in Newfoundland and Labrador in 1909. That province now is generally infested, and it's believed that it was probably brought to North America because you're probably aware it was found in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Maryland as well. It was probably through the movement of settlers into Canada and into North America in general, and the planting of those backyard gardens and the settlement properties, and they would have brought potatoes either from Europe, or they would have been legally imported before 1912. Now, what's unfortunate about the situation for PI is those potatoes probably were brought into commercial production when homesteads were taken down and gardens were incorporated into the fields. That didn't occur in Newfoundland, of course. They're not they don't have a very large potato industry as we have in PI. Of course, in Prince Edward Island, potato wort was found in 2000, and we know we have around 180 seed potato growers, and I believe there's around 330 potato growers every year. And the annual acreage is around 85,000 acres per year. Industry does have a seed potato table stock and processing, but 60% of the industry is dedicated towards processing products. Now, potato wort is a federally regulated pest, and it's under the responsibility of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as the lead federal department. And it's regulated under the Plant Protection Act and regulations themselves, but we also have a series of different legislations that come into play, because potatoes are, of course, they become food at one point. It's a seed potato, and so there's a collection of different regulations that assist us in regulating this pest. The phytosanitary requirements are in the Plant Protection Act and regulations. But when we're dealing with seed potato farms and the quality pests and ensuring those potatoes are high quality, it actually falls under the Seeds Act and regulations. So we have two acts in plant protection that we can use and take advantage of all the tools and inspection requirements of those programs to make sure that it's held in check whenever we do find it, and that areas that don't have it remain as pest-free. But of course, as it becomes food, we can also rely on the federal fresh fruit and vegetable regulations of the Safe Foods for Canadians Act. And we have other tools and standards that we use. Along with that would be the National Farm Level Biosecurity Standard for potato growers that was developed with the potato industry and representatives across Canada, including PI. Quickly talk about the biology. It's a fungus. We're dealing with a fungus that infects soil, and the fungus itself infects the potato tuber. The most active stage occurs during the summer, and you can see from that diagram there how complex the life cycle is. The typical expression of potato wort is what you see up in this tuber here, and the formation of these galls. This actually occurs under the soil, and they're responsible, and these zoospores are responsible for invading the potato, usually through the eyes, and infecting it. And this occurs all through the summer when you have enough water, moderate temperature, and of course you need that host. So there's certain conditions that have to be met for potato wort to become a problem and attack the tubers. And this cycle of these zoospores actually occurs over a 10-day cycle. But there's also a winter stage or resting stage, and it's really the complexity of two. So your visual inspections are very good at finding this particular situation, but what we realize is that within these galls are these series of resting spores. Now, the researchers tell me that the average infected tuber can have somewhere between 100,000 and 600,000 resting spores, and they are microscopic. So any program that you build to mitigate potato wart needs to take advantage of both the visual and the soil sampling methods to be able to find all life cycles, all life stages. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, in regulating, this is a quarantine pest, we regulate all life stages of it. Now, what's difficult and challenging about managing a pest that has resting spores, particularly potato wart, is they do have a dormant stage, and they can remain dormant for 40 years, waiting for these conditions to be met over here. Now, here's a zoom up of the resting spore. So inside that resting spore, you're going to have 200 to 300 zoospores, and that's those guys over here. And this is what it looks like when the zoospores have these conditions. The zoospore itself, the outer coating ruptures, and the little zoospores come out. So it blends this life cycle with this life cycle stage, and it continues that process. This tuber here would provide what your classic observations are and your textbook examples, but these tubers here actually display all of the different stages of infection of potato wart, and these were tubers that were collected from one of the fields on October 1st. Now you can see the different advancements of infection. So these tubers here, which hardly look like russet Burbank anymore, they were probably attacked in the early season of the summer, and you would have had the repetitive attack of those zoospores creating more and more galls throughout that tuber. These tubers here, this is almost a fully formed russet Burbank. You can see that the galls are starting here and here. Now, this picture also tells you a lot about some of the properties you need to consider when developing your risk management programs. Obviously, these types of tubers get called out through the grading process. The soil on this particular tuber will fall off the tuber either through the grading process, the brushing, or the washing process. Or perhaps if it goes into storage as dry brush, there might be some soil. So any program needs to address the called potatoes that come out of it, the soil related, and of course, if you're going to wash that, which happens, you got a wash water issue to take care of as well. And so down at the bottom here are many of the key steps, and the strength of our program isn't built on just one single element. It's the layering of phytosanitary measures that make it a program that is working for us and is mitigating the risk presented by potato wart and assures our customer base in Canada and around the world that the potatoes we're getting from PI, in fact, are high quality and free of potato wart. So that would be the land restrictions that I will talk about in a minute. Of course, the grading system we have in place, the washing, the inspection, the biosecurity principles that were just mentioned, the application of a sprout inhibitor if they're for food, and the communication between the grower and the inspector is very, very important. So within our normal programs, such as the National Seed Potato Program or our food program, there's lots of dialogue. But obviously, whenever there's a field that's regulated for potato wart, there's increased discussion between them as they develop programs and certification systems to be able to continue to use that land for potato production. And of course, the development of tools called compliance agreements is at the facility level and endless training. Now, at some point, potato wart will be introduced into a field. So this is a hypothetical example here. Now, the difficulty in dealing with any regulated pest, and this is a normal growth curve that we could be using with a virus, with a fungus, perhaps even an insect. The population will increase over time when the conditions are met. And we're looking for water, the temperature, and of course the proximity of a host. So with potatoes, of course, we have lots of tools that we can use to mitigate, suppress, and diminish the population size. The crop you plant is very important. The length of the rotation, the amount of water or irrigation that occurs is also pertinent. And as we know, the danger zone really for unknown spread is this early stages before somehow it's detected through visual or through soil sampling methodology. So at this point in here is probably where the potato wart spreads within the farm through its spreading mechanisms, which is either going to be the movement of a tuber or soil or equipment with soil from an infested field or the portion of the field that's infested. The challenge is, of course, if it's infested with the resting spore stage, is that they're microscopic and they're very persistent over time. Now, we do know that without a host crop present, there is quite a significant die-off of the population. But unfortunately, a portion of the population will continue to live on in dormancy, waiting for that opportunity for a tuber to be planted near it. So the other important factor is if you lengthen the rotations and you use what's called resistant varieties, you will suppress the population to a point that hopefully it isn't infectious anymore. And then you're starting to win the battle against potato wort. And in Canada, that is part of our program. And we have a number of popular varieties such as Gold Rush and Prospect that are used in industry. Those two particular varieties are grown at high volumes in PI. Unfortunately, some of the more popular varieties such as Russet Burbank and Atlantic are highly susceptible to potato wort. So it's really the combination of working closely with the grower that is impacted by this pest and making sure that their biosecurity management plans are in place that ensure they'll continue to have high quality product. Now, as you know, we have the potato wort management plan, and so I can talk a little bit about that. That plan followed the immediate investigation in 2000 and was indicated was a plan that was developed between the United States and Canada. And I would say that with every investigation and every tool that we've developed, there are always four players at the table for the Canadian side, and that would be Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the province of PEI, the PEI Potato Board, and the CFIA, of course. I know we haven't released that document. It obviously contains sensitive information because it's pertinent to the investigations over time and the lessons learned that we've had. So I talk about it with industry, and we put on workshops and things to demonstrate the value of it. And that's an effort that I also have undertaken with the United States to take those opportunities to explain the strength of the Canadian program and to provide those assurances that what you do receive from PI is high quality and free from potato wort. So of course, like all the policies we develop in the CFIA as a science-based regulator are built on international standards, input from stakeholders, and of course, the science itself. And in the development of any program, there's a number of stages, and we always start with a pest risk assessment, looking at various elements of the biology or the pathway, the detection method, or climate suitability and factors like that. That type of information populates a risk management development stage where we look at all of the options, and that's generally the stage that we'll consult with industry and other stakeholders to make sure that we have their valuable input. And then the end product would be a policy such as the Potato Wort Long-Term Management Program. And that particular policy has been effective for us and refined over the years. The current version was from March 9th, 2009, because it casts a wide net and it regulates a lot of properties that could be at risk and assures that it responds quickly to a detection. It has an objective to contain and control potato wort, which it does effectively. And it has a land-based classification system, which I have a slide on, that really targets the most likely places potato wort's going to be and to work with those growers to manage the land and ensure that they can produce a potato crop. So overall, it effectively reduces the threat presented by potato wort and suppresses any populations that we do find in an infested field. And holding that program over time could lead to eradication. But with any program, every time we have an investigation, we do a program review and we try to tighten the program to make it stronger and stronger. And if there are any gaps realized, that they're addressed. And I think what we also learn is that every case can be a little bit different and there's always something to learn. And not only do we work with industry and other federal government departments like Agriculture Canada, but we do spend time with technical officials in the United States and other countries like the Netherlands. Learning from their lessons and their expectations. And overall, it's a very effective program in preventing spread. But it is a long, lengthy program. And of course, potato wort and PI, unfortunately, has been introduced into some of the potato production fields that we have. And those are very historical lands and they've been used by many families. So it's important that we try to continue to develop a program that allows the impacted regulated party to continue to produce and be active in the agriculture community. There is an interest in continuing to plant and use those lands for potato production. So the program itself is one that's built to continuously assess regulated land over time and to allow the planting of potatoes in regulated fields. And although it may sound surprising, it is a program that is developed with strict controls to even allow planting in index fields, which does occur. So for the first 5 years, in the use of an index field, of course, there's no potatoes permitted. And that's really taking advantage of that population dieback from lack of a host. Now, the program doesn't start there. You have to continue it over many, many years. And I would suspect that an index field would probably be regulated for greater than 30 years. And it's kind of broken on 5-year periods where we continuously assess the land, one through soil testing to make sure it doesn't have potato wort. And then we also do something called a bioassay. So we're testing it from a different angle to determine if there's anything viable in the soil. And it starts with using those resistant potato varieties that I mentioned before. Again, that's a very effective tool in suppressing the population. They have a very hard time challenging and reproducing on resistant varieties. And if you do that successfully over several crops, 3 crops, 4 crops, that population will be suppressed to a point that it probably has been wiped out. And then from there, we would do 2 more crops, but they would be susceptible varieties to determine if that population is going to be bounced back. So we haven't had any fields graduate to that point in time, but we've been able to keep them in potato production to the benefit of the grower. Now, all of the classifications have their own regimen on testing and a graduated release from regulatory control. And I have a slide that will cover that to some degree. And basically, overall, the program is designed to prevent spread, suppress the population, and does allow for restricted potato production based on this risk-based criteria that I just mentioned, and I'll explain farther. This is an interesting slide and an animation for you because it looks at the use of land, and it blends in with the investigation process, the potato wort management plan, and it's a risk-based categorization of fields. So if I just use the pointer here, this field was infested, and it could be from the settler's garden I mentioned, or it could be some connection with an infested field in another investigation, or perhaps there's an issue with the seed source. So an important part of the investigation is to go in and figure out where it came from and identify that origin. And that high risk period, of course, is from that graph that I showed you where it's not known yet by the farmer. And so what you'll see is you'll have on-farm spread, right? And it's most likely probably the spread of the resting spores in the soil. I guess in some cases it could be from the tubers, but they're usually picked up in grading and observations, inspections by the farmer. And of course, because potato wort is a soil-borne pest, any soil that's affixed to machinery could be spread naturally through any fields that are adjacent to it. Now, there's wider spread to other fields, which we call primary contact fields, and that could be through tuber movement, soil, or equipment movement. It particularly gets tricky when that particular field is rented or leased, and then now you've got a third party involved. But potato wort does have a capability of moving short distances. The fungus itself, without a host, obviously is not going to move anywhere. But because it is in the soil, you can have the effect of water or wind erosion that could inadvertently carry it. So we do regulate the adjacent fields on other farms to the index field. I would view that as a low-risk field because you don't have the typical movement of machinery or shared equipment or tubers happening there. But nonetheless, our program is very rigid, and we look at every aspect and make sure that there is no contamination to other farms and no spread. So we do look back in our investigations at the seed sources and, of course, all of these fields. I think in general, when I would classify these, the high-risk fields would obviously be the infested field, the adjacent fields on the farm, and the primary contact fields that were in association with the farm. But those primary contact fields could in fact be on another farm. If this particular scenario was a seed potato farm and that person sold seed and didn't realize it was infected, you possibly could have moved it to another farm, and this third farm obviously would be spreading it inadvertently until they detected it throughout their system. And then the other scenario is, because it's rented land, you have now another combination of people using the property, and you could bring in a fourth farm. So this is a hypothetical example, but it demonstrates how potato wort can spread, the pathways of spread, and it is the foundation of our investigation and our management plan. So in this scenario, all of these fields would be heavily regulated by the CFIA. They'd be tested, and we would meet one-on-one, obviously, with all of the affected parties involved to go through the scenario of how to continue to use the land safely, how to continue to produce potatoes. Now, whenever we do detect it, of course, we have an investigation, which is an immediate response. The investigation is part of the long-term management plan, and that the cornerstone, of course, is the field classification system. And we have the routine quarantine controls and containment processes that come into play. The crop, of course, would be detained. We have serious cleaning and disinfection of equipment, tools, and storage. This is actually a cooperation with the provincial government, because they help us out with the cleaning and disinfection, which we appreciate the partnership. And of course, working with all regulated parties. So I would say in every investigation, we spend a considerable amount of time with our colleagues in the PI Potato Board, who help us and help transition the information to industry and give us good advice and guidance. Of course, any regulatory decision purely resides with the CFIA as the competent authority for the Government of Canada. Now, the field classification system here does a trace back for 10 years. And usually what happens in investigation is you'll find that the fields that have become infested will have been planted in the past, probably 3 times over 10 years if it's a 3-year crop rotation. So this does generate a lot of fields that will be regulated, and typically, one regulated field will mean a lot of other fields that must be surveyed and visually inspected and quarantined, etc. So under the Plant Protection Act and regulations, we're required to issue notices directly to the landowner and the people in control and use of the land. And there's a variety of different notices that come into play. When populations are small and your event is very small, this is a very effective way and has been the baseline of how we have been notifying and providing instructions and communication and the restrictions for the landowners. But as the population and the activities grow larger, you start needing to look at a more robust tool that has the same value, the same weight, and the same purposes, and that's where the ministerial orders come into play. So those notices there, they're actual notices that would be used. I've redacted the personal information, but you can see that they're government-issued permits to allow and restrict activities, and there typically would be a notice of prohibition of movement, a notice prohibiting or restricting the use of a place, or a notice ordering a treatment or process required. So that's all part of the system of controlling the regulated crop and ensuring that any future crops that are used on that farm are dealt with in accordance to the long-term management plan. Nevertheless, because so many fields will require to be monitored and regulated, every investigation does require the collection of thousands of samples. Of course, the regulatory work and the shared responsibilities go well past the CFIA, and I've spoken to the regulatory controls, the containment controls, the development of compliance agreements. I've touched on the official testing and surveillance, which are some of the activities that you can see going on here, and the overall certification of any crop in the regulated zone or other places in PI in Canada as well. But the province, of course, has a role, and I mentioned the cleaning and disinfection. They assist us with management of that on the index, adjacent, and primary contact fields. The grower, of course, is the regulated party, and they have a lot of responsibilities to assist in this, and the cooperation that we've had is just excellent. And that's why our program works so well, the close working relationship between the regulated party, who now understands the purpose of our program. But of course, their biosecurity and their record keeping are key. They have the variety selection and the rotation, the basic farming practices that would help moderate the regulated fields. And their objectives might be to produce seed, table, or processing. And those activities are all covered within our long-term management plan. And of course, the farmer knows the land best, and they're always doing crop and grading inspections to serve their customer in their own interests. But on top of that, of course, we work with industry, and they do have a variety of inspection requirements because the quality of the tuber is important for processing and for food for consumption. So we know about the agricultural crop insurance and the post-harvest virus testing and all of the activities that processors and other facilities will undertake. So this adds in thousands of visual inspections into the system. The CFI generally takes care of the inspection related to the field and the post-harvest activities and the certification for trade or movement, as well as the soil sampling. And the industry also does a good job in assisting us with promoting the on-farm biosecurity principles that should be used. Now let's have a quick look at the status of the situation of PI. Of course, we already know the tombstone data of what you've heard earlier today, but there is at least one index field in each of the counties in PEI, but the majority of the counties with fines are in Queens and Prince. Based on the long-term management plan and the information that I've described earlier, we do regulate just a little over 35,400 acres of land that's regulated and monitored, and we do have to caretake around 1,400 fields, so that you can see the volume of the work is increasing, unfortunately, with each fine. But that's the commitment we have and the investments that we've taken over time to support the management of potato wort, to ensure that our growers are well taken care of, and we're able to continue to produce the potatoes that we've had a long history of doing. Now, obviously, any of the regulated fields, we do talk about the regulations in terms of decades, and everything is captured and consistent with the management plan. Now, often people have asked me what changed. Why did this suddenly happen? And it's a very complex question. From a risk assessor and risk management point of view, it's never one or only an individual event. It's the accumulation of events over time and the adjustments the program take to mitigate that risk. So here's just a snapshot back to 2012, and it does give you an idea of the types of numbers of samples that we have to collect. So in PI, of course, we have an export plan, so we have some bonus samples here. And you can see the numbers of samples that we've collected. We're now at about 409 for this year in PI. Those are outside of the direct regulatory program, and those samples are all negative, which is a good sign. But you can see we had a detection in 2012, and these are the samples that came out of that program. And you can see that they're recorded in 2 years. So the work in that investigation did carry over the winter months and into the spring to fulfill those testing requirements. We had another detection in 2014. That was a particularly difficult scenario for Canada, because that was an investigation on a sea potato farm, and you can see the large number of samples that were taken to satisfy that. But that event there was also of interest to the United States, and they did come to Canada, and they did basically an audit in PEI to make sure that the program was running to their expectations. But it did lead to the creation of a U.S. federal order in 2015 that was a layer on top of our long-term management plan. So anytime that the CFI would be updating or changing any of the conditions of the management plan, it's now tied to the U.S. federal order, which is tied to the conditions of export for Prince Edward Island. So any changes to the management plan will involve, of course, working with Agriculture Canada, PEI, and the PEI Potato Board, along with the other stakeholders in Canada, because being that it's a quarantine pest, there's a broad base of stakeholders that assist and give us their viewpoints and input to make sure the program is satisfactory to everybody's outcome. Some of these samples here would be our regulatory samples that are related to investigations in the past and our routine sampling levels. Then, of course, we had an investigation in 2018, and the samples were predominantly collected in 2019. That was a late season find, right? This number here was also influenced by some regulatory work. Every 5 years, we have to go back to those index fields, and we sample the soil, and we do bioassays to monitor and understand the level of infection, or hopefully the fact that it's diminished and is nearing a really depleted population. So sometimes the samples will bump up simply because of regulatory work. In this case, it was the investigation in 2018. And of course, just last October, in 2020, we had the investigation on a second sea potato farm. And then unfortunately, this year we've had the detections on 2 processing farms. But you can see from the repetitiveness, the 2012, 14, 18, 20, and 21, this is the era that changed and heightened a higher response to make sure that the plan was on track and was continuing to meet our goals and objectives. So in around 2020, in response to that detection, we did do a program review, and we commenced with a more thorough pest risk assessment, which would again populate our understanding of how to develop probably the next level of a risk development document to look at the options to improve our program. And that was interrupted, of course, by the detections that we had here. So the 2020 work will just continue to blend into 2021. Another way of looking at the events of PI is to think about it in terms of clusters. it's an interesting concept because some of the scenarios are independent of themselves. So each of those 4 clusters are not interrelated. And those four clusters also do not have a known source. They were all conducted through our investigation process and the provisions of the long-term management plan. But you can see, for example, that the original 2000 event is actually related to the fines of October 1st and October 14th. And most of those events occurred on the same farm and were controlled, and most of them obviously were found within the context of the long-term management plan. So we have the strength of realizing that our plan is very effective in finding where the likely source of new infection would be based on a trace back, trace forward, and working closely with the regulated party. But you can see that we had a series of events, investigations related back to 2000, and that all those events are related to processing farms. The event of 2012, which had subsequent events in 13 and 14, was related to a table stock and processing farm. I've also included the number of farms that are directly involved because they actually have 1 or more index fields involved. The 2014 event, which was that seed potato farm event that led to the U.S. posting the federal order, with subsequent fines in 2015-16 involved, in this case, 11 index fields on 3 different farms, and then the most recent event of last year, which is independent of those other 3 clusters. So it's just another way of grouping and trying to understand the relatedness of this pest. And folks often think of it as a social pest because on its own, it doesn't spread far and perhaps can't spread at all. So it's really the human mediated movement that spreads the pest, or a breakdown in a biosecurity program or something to some effect as that. Now, a snapshot in this investigation here, and all the photos, by the way, that I'm showing you are of the investigation this year. So you can see some of the tubers, again, had a lot of infection on it, and others had very, very minor. Now, this is a per field look. This is a basic shape of the field where we found it, and this was the first tuber that came out of it, and that was russet burbank. And so you can see it did have a high level of infection on that tuber. It was found in one area of the farm, but of course, the visual survey would find it here, but we're also interested in those resting spores that would cleave off this tuber and then be deposited into the soil. And of course, with any farm activity, those resting spores can move forward and backwards and sideways depending on the physical nature of what's happening to that location. But you can see here the intensity of our program. So this particular field was known as a contact field, if you can remember back to that schematic. And so it was negative at this point in time, but it was associated with the 2012 investigation. The field was tested in 2013. The grower elected to plant russet burbank, which of course is one of our most popular varieties. And behind each one of these planting seasons, we do our surveillance, our visual crop inspection, our tuber inspection, then walk the field. And so you can see it was negative all through these activities. And according to that classification of a contact field, you need to have it soil sampled once, and then it would be eligible for 2 more surveillance inspections. So theoretically could have come eligible for shipping in 2016 or 2018. And the overall program requires that it be inspected for 5 crops. Usually we have a 5 crop standard. The efficacy of your testing program is really improved with every planting of a potato farm and potato crop testing behind it. So quite often you'll hear me talk about, it's a 5 crop testing season. So that really moves the event, over a very long period of time. In this case, there was no risk of any movement because this grower, the production farm, produced potatoes for processing. It was a 69-acre field, and it never left the island, and it was contained within this rigorous system, and the end product was a processed potato, which is well contained and taken care of. So there was no risk for potatoes leaving the island or export. But as you can see, it does look like we're going to have a lot of fields to investigate and sample as related to that. The next farm is a lot more complicated, and there's been a tremendous amount of testing and surveillance on it. So it was associated directly with the 2000, so the original find. and it had been soil sampled and it had resumed testing here. This grower elected to use what's called a strip cropping program. So the CFIA regulates not based on the part of the field, but the physical boundaries of the field. So the field look like something like this. It could be boundaried by a road, it could have a creek, it could have a forest. So there's a natural break from the next production field. In this case, the grower elected to do strip cropping, which I understand is a very environmentally conscious way to plant. So it has lots of benefits. But what it did do is it put a crop of potatoes in the field as it would rotate from year to year. So small sections of the field would be used for potato production, and the other part would be perhaps another type of crop. And because that behavior occurred, we actually did surveillance on every single crop. So we did a 10-year surveillance activity on this. It was soil sampled twice. And unfortunately, the grower did find it infested this year, as you're all aware. But being that it was a primary contact field, it would never really be released from regulatory control. But what's very interesting about it, it became connected to the 2018 investigation and would have been classified as a contact field if it hadn't had this previous history. It as well will be, there will be a lot of fields associated with that find there. Everybody wants to know about why we notified and what our obligations are. So in this case, potato wort was found in 2 fields that it wasn't in before. So that triggers our obligation to notify our trading partners through the International Plant Protection Convention, which is a commitment and an obligation that Canada has signed under. And according to that process, we notify actually through the NAPO system, which is an umbrella organization of the IPPC. It's a very short notice that was put out, I believe it was on October 29th. So what we need to do first is make sure we understand and delimit the population, which we have done, identify the fields for testing, the measures that need to be in place, and then we have the assurances to issue that notification. Now, we also have a second notification system through CUSMA, which is the free trade agreement with the United States and Mexico. So there were 2 international obligations to notify. But irregardless of that activity, potato wort is a quarantine pest and it is well known. And so we always end up being requested to talk about the status of potato wort and PEI, and we do report on the status of potato wort in Newfoundland as well. So I always provide written notification to the Canadian Horticulture Council and the Canadian potato industry so that they can submit that messages all the way down to every grower in all the memberships of the potato boards or the association. And of course, I have regular meetings with the Canadian potato industry. Potato wort is always a rolling agenda, so it does get reported out as a readout every year, at least 3 times in person. We do have, of course, our regular meetings with USDA, and they have it as a rolling agenda item as well. As a key trading partner, they do have a risk to manage, so they keep it they keep well advised of any changes in the status of it. And I am a member of the Potato Association of America certification section, and that is always an agenda item there. And that's a meeting of U.S. state officials, and I represent Canada in that organization. And industry are allowed to attend as observers, and we have a good contingency, always from Canada, and I would say always from the PI Potato Board. And of course, we do have pre-meetings and preliminary discussions before any event I go to make sure everybody is aware of the newest details of the investigation, the status, and the testing volumes that are coming in. And there is another very interesting meeting, which is the Canada-US Potato Committee meeting, which is led by industry. It's co-chaired by Canada and the United States. It didn't meet this year as planned, I think mostly because of COVID. But that's another opportunity we will directly talk to the US industry. And it's actually led by the Canadian industry, and I'm invited as an observer to report out on both PCN and potato wort and any changes to the certification systems we have. So there's a lot of consultation that involves the growing industry in Canada, the United States, and they do get frequent updates, and they are able to meet directly with me and ask any questions they may have on the program to make sure that they're aware of any developments. Domestic program update. So of course, every time we have an investigation, we do that program review, we refresh the science, and we make changes as required. One of the big activities we have is, of course, that stakeholder engagement and collaboration, because their input is very important to us, and they've given me lots of information to build on my understanding of potato production in each area of Canada. and it's a very interactive process. So, I can assure you that we meet regularly with the PI government, the PI Potato Board, and I've even met with the growers of PI in person. Pardon me, it was by virtual, but the last meeting I was at, there was 107 participants. So they're able to talk to me, and I can explain what's happening and address any concerns I have, and we can work together to build a better program and make sure there's clear awareness there. And that's my commitment to continue to do that. Of course, with the PI Potato Board, I think I meet with them almost every day, certainly every week at minimum. And Mr. Rosser might respond more to this, because we have established, and you would have seen the press release on the AFC PI Potato Board co-chaired working group, and we kind of have a sub working group, and that's where I meet with the PI Potato Board, the province, and Agriculture Canada members. And so you can see, in response to this event alone, we have a very good forum that's developed here with our ongoing. Now, at the national level, I meet with Horticulture Council, the Canadian Potato Committee, and the Canadian Sea Potato Subcommittee. And again, we have all of these events to meet, to discuss, to share information, and I have the opportunity to address any concerns and make sure people realize how strong our program is, and how they can be assured that the potatoes they're receiving are free from potato wart. And I didn't want to forget but mention the interactions with the United States. We have a very good and collaborative relationship with the USDA APHIS, and as we did last year, we've continued our bilateral technical working group, which is one of the principal ways that we share and communicate the information to them directly. And we address any rumors or miscommunications you might be seeing outside of the discussions that government have. So they do receive the information they're requesting. I do get to present the information with the context of the investigation and our evaluation. So it's a very effective way to work together. Now, you heard from the opening speech that we did implement the potato wart order in November 21st of this year. Now, that order, by the way, is developed so that it's very consistent with the provisions of the U.S. federal order. And it's also very consistent with the import requirements that we establish for potatoes coming in from the United States to Canada, perhaps from a state like a state like Idaho, where they have PCN.
Gordon, sorry.
Yes.
How many more slides do you have?
Just a couple more. I can skip along at a quicker pace if you like.
Just where the time goes quickly, and then I know there's quite a few questions that the members have, so I just want to make sure they can get them all in. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So this is, I'll quickly move over these few slides. So here's a schematic. We can look at that another time, but you can see that when you apply the mitigation measures such as washing, sprout, inhibiting, grading, they become exempt in our program. So this ensures that we have a continued supply of high quality PI potatoes moving into Canada. If the potatoes happen to be unwashed, then the receiving facility can be put on a compliance agreement, and you get the same sort of effect that the potatoes continue to have access. We divide it into processed potatoes and table stock. The only place that there are restrictions, of course, if you're going to produce potato stock that are unwashed, then they get restricted. But perhaps we can build a compliance program at a later date that would satisfy that and continue that on. I'll just highlight this. There is a National Potato Wart Survey, which was a new development. You can see the samples for PI are right here. This gives us more assurances across Canada that we have tested. This is a soil sample-based program. Trade with the United States. There's the provisions of the federal order. There's the front page of it. You can Google that, but you can see that there's existing requirements for seed, table stock, bulk, and unwashed that exist. The implications related to 2021, of course, it's related to the series of suspensions that were put in place, and you heard information about that earlier, so I don't think I need to cover that. The technical working group with the United States is ongoing. We've had the December 10th and 16th meeting. We're looking forward to one next week, and then we have another one planned for January. And obviously, we're trying to normalize trade as quickly as possible. So looking forward, here are the requirements that the U.S. are looking for. They want the results of that national soil sampling survey, which should be out later this month. They want to complete their own pest risk assessment, which we're helping them on. Obviously, we're all looking forward to the outcomes of the investigation in terms of soil sampling and inspections. They are requesting a map of the area and PI to understand the relationship between the 5 field classifications. And of course, they do want the assurances that the population has been delimited, which is the outcome of the investigation. And if required, I can always put a slide up about Idaho, Idaho if you request. And I did have a meeting with the Netherlands yesterday, and so I have some very interesting information if any questions come up on that. But I can point out from this picture here, and I tried to put PI in scale there, the area that they have issues with potato wort tends to be up here and in this zone here. Their seed protection, their seed producing area tends to be over here. So they have a nice ability to zone it so that they can protect their seed potato and these areas here. So they have an excellent program, and we did learn some best practices from it, which I can go over at a later time if required. So I think with that, Mr. Chair, I can stop sharing and end the presentation.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Appreciate that. Okay, we'll start with questions, and first on my list is Hal Perry.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank each of you for making time available to present and to field some questions from us. So last year, October 2020, there was a suspension on seed potatoes, the movement of seed potatoes from PEI to the U.S., put in place by CFIA. How did that suspension, it was 6 months apparently, or approximately, how did that suspension end? What were the reasons?
I can take that question. So last year, it was an October detection, and we were able to conduct the investigation quickly. What was interesting about that detection was we found trace amounts. We were able to detect it quite readily, and the number of fields involved were minimized with that ability for early detection. So we're able to get all of the testing completed and in the lab and resolved. I think it was somewhere around February, and then we're able to resume those negotiations with the United States. We did have to have a lot of technical meetings. I think there were 7 in total where we went through the investigation. We were able to satisfy them, as we had in the many years before, that the program in place, layered with the U.S. federal order, was sufficient in addressing any risk presented to the United States. So once that was confirmed, we were required to have a 4-party meeting between the Canadian industry, U.S. industry, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and USDA APHIS officials. And I did have a very long presentation for them, and I was able to respond to every question, and the U.S. industry and the U.S. government were able to take the position that the suspension could be moved in March. That's a process we're looking forward to doing this year as well.
Hal?
Thank you very much, Chair. So with the suspension last year on seed potatoes, and again, CFI placing that suspension this fall in November the 2nd on seed potatoes, and then later one being put on with for table stock. Why was table stock not suspended in 2020, and why was it this year? What was the reasons why it wasn't last year, and the reasons why it was this year?
Well, my personal position is it should have been limited to seed potatoes as it was the previous year. But I think the repetitiveness of detection, so we did have 4 fields on 3 farms within 1 year. And when you look at the scale and scope of the investigations from October 1st and October 14th, the U.S. wanted a pause. They originally had requested, a suspension for seed potato, but when the second find came in, which was also a large investigation, they decided that they would like to have an abundance of caution and to suspend all trade in potatoes from PI until they've had the time to review their, the investigation, develop that pest risk assessment, and all of the other things that we've learned over the last couple of weeks.
Hal?
Thank you very much, Chair. So with that said, with what you've learned over the last couple of weeks, with what you've learned over the last year, dealing with the investigation that started in October of last year, and were there any recommendations or measures put in place by CFIA, or did you make any recommendations to the province, let's say, to try to prevent this from happening again this year?
Yeah, so if I back up to the events of 2020, that investigation, we learned more about the behavior of potato wort, and we did conduct that pest risk assessment, which was completed, and we were proceeding with a risk management review, it did result in the institution of the National Potato Wort Survey. We wanted more samples in PI, and we wanted more samples across Canada. We didn't want anyone to have any concerns that potato wort was spreading from PEI to other parts of Canada, and you need the raw data. So that was one major activity that was well received and provided new data, new assurances that it was contained to the limited areas of PEI. Now, through that process, we also would be reviewing to develop the different options, and we'd be looking at things like the management of farms where they had at least one index field, and we'd be looking at better ways to assure that we have area freedom within the rest of PI. And of course, that work was interrupted with the detections in October. All of these processes and the evaluation do take a long time because it's based on science and comparing to international standards. So we don't have that ready, quick switch over to just add activities. They have to be justified and they have to be of value. And we also would be moving in tandem with consulting with stakeholders to make sure that they had awareness and to learn any input. So it isn't an instant response. It's something that's developed, through science and drafting over time, and it will just continue with the lessons learned from this investigation.
Hal?
Thank you very much, Chair. And that's very concerning that you are learning through the investigation, because of course, the investigation started this particular one that we're talking about now last year and ran over into this year. And if I was a producer, I'd be really concerned about even putting anything into the ground for next year. So what assurances can the producers have that it won't happen again next year? I know it's a tough question, but it's one that every producer would be thinking of.
You have to look back to the implementation of the long-term management plan. Of course, the two fields that were found this year were already tracked and under regulatory control, so that they were expected. And of course, in any investigation, because of that on-farm movement, you might have new fields that get involved, and so you always have an expanding area. Now, one of the tools that we put in place was the ministerial order, and that allowed us to develop new programs and give us new regulatory authorities to work with the growers and the producers and PI to make sure that it all happens under a compliance agreement and happens within preventative control plans, so we can reassure our trading partners and the growers of PI that every provision and every check and balance is in place, that enough inspections, enough soil sampling, and all the mitigation measures that I talked about before are in place. For example, if you look at the application of a sprout inhibitor, which of course is going to be used on table stock, and its goal is to stop the potato from growing, so that it's not going to be worthwhile to plant, and another layering to keep it out of being planted. So when we look at the efficacy of it, of course, we have another federal government department that is responsible for that. We can demonstrate that we have very strong controls at the federal level and the provincial level through the pesticide programs, and implement that and bring that back into a compliance agreement with the growers and the facilities that are implicated, so that we can demonstrate we have a very adequate program to address all the risks and all the pathways that we need to mitigate.
Hal?
Thank you very much, Chair. You mentioned earlier that there are identified conditions that the U.S. is requesting. If all those conditions are met, then will CFIA lift this suspension?
That's our plan. Now, you have to remember that, when potato wort was found and we had those early discussions with the United States, and they did request for a suspension, there are two ways they can achieve that same outcome. I think, as was explained, if the United States puts in a federal order, we lose the control of when the suspension or trade stop can be removed. It's far better for us to remain in control and use our own internal suspensions to that same outcome. But in either event, the United States operationalizes the requirement, so they update their border manuals and they educate their inspectors that when a shipment from PI comes, it has to meet these conditions. So with the suspension, without the suspension, it's still operationalized in the United States. And so the removal of the suspension is contingent on making sure that the U.S. is assured that the program in place meets their needs, and then we collectively will lift it together and allow trade to resume.
Hal?
Thank you very much. Just for clarity on this, so in the process, so after the detection, there's a process in place for all those I guess because of the agreement, everyone was informed. And so are you saying that the U.S. then sent in a request to CFIA saying you have to meet these identified conditions, or we will put stricter, they could actually close it themselves? Is that what you're saying? So they put in the request to CFIA, and you guys determined then, yes, we want to go this route because you think it's going to be easier to open it up earlier?
Well, we meet with the United States government. We do things in person or by virtual call, so the context is kept, and they understand the measures that we've taken and the steps we've done. And so based on the information that we provide and the dialogue that we have at the technical and senior levels, they thus can make the determination, and then they inform us that in this case we would like either you to suspend it or for the United States to impose a federal order. The choice is yours, Canada, and of course we want to remain in control for our own destiny and make sure that the investigation is followed through. I see the CFI president wants to jump in.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would like to add a few things on to what Gordon has said. I think it's important to recognize the fact that the federal order allows for the minister to modify, change, or revoke the order at any time. So at any point in time, if the conditions are met and our conversations and technical discussions with the US get to a stage where we are able to do that, this is an easier route rather than the other, where there is a federal order that has been put in place by the US, which was the rationale for why we went the route of coming out with a ministerial order. And perhaps in terms of the discussions with the US, Mr. Chair, I would suggest that maybe David Bailey, who has been involved in the technical discussions, can give us a bit more in terms of the conversations with the US and some of their preoccupations. Thank you.
For the chair?
Yeah. You're good. We can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that as Gord has outlined, that there had been ongoing conversations with the United States from, the various fines. The first one in 2020, the ones in the two in October. And I think what you have to come back to is the earlier slides that Gord had presented around risk assessment, right? So the United States isn't looking at just the one fine or the second fine. They're looking at a 21-year history of fines. They're looking at 33 different things that have happened. And so if you put a risk assessor's lens on, you're talking about a risk assessment question, a risk mitigation question, and risk tolerance. So for them, they want to see the outcome of risk assessments, their own risk assessment work. They want to see the work from our investigation, which comes under and out of the long-term management plan. And they have to be satisfied as an importing country with their own risk tolerance. So it is within that context that they, approach Canada with really, a devil's bargain, if you will, which was simply, we will put a federal order in place. And they were very clear at the most senior levels with our minister and with us at all levels that the federal order would be put in place. But we will give you, Canada, an opportunity to take an action of your own. And the reason that they did that is because they know that for us, once we've satisfied their needs, we can bring down those notifications and the ministerial order very, very quickly. We can do that in a day. With an American federal order, it is almost virtually impossible to bring that order down and can take many, many months. So as Gordon said, it left the control to us to make a decision between two terrible choices. We chose the choice that gave us some ability to move forward more quickly once we get agreement with the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Hal?
Thank you very much, Chair. So my final question will be, knowing what the identified conditions are, and you're presently working on them, what is the expected timeline for the suspension to be lifted?
David, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. Thank you, Siddika. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. You know, it's a very good question, right? And when will the investigation be completed? So, you know, as Gord had outlined, we have met with the United States and have had the opportunity to learn more about what they want, and we've clarified that in the presentation, and we understand that with greater clarity now. The results of the investigation are an important piece of the data requested by APHIS, and we need to be clear about what that is, but not the only piece. And we are working to provide that information as it becomes available. You know, Gord mentioned the National Potato Wart Survey results that will become available at the end of this calendar year or early in the new year. And that's a key piece for the United States. And the CFIA is pulling out all the stops to complete the investigation into these detections, and we're moving as quickly as possible. But, you know, as Gord pointed out, this is a science-based exercise with our United States counterparts, and it takes time. And given the scope of the investigation, this compounds the time question. And so, you know, from all of these results, they may not be ready, and I want to underscore may not be ready. May is an important word here, before 2023. However, that does not mean that CFI is waiting for that endpoint. As we gather information, as we're able to demonstrate things in an ongoing fashion with the United States through this investigation, and they become available to clarify points, whether we're able to clarify points on table stock and sprout inhibitors to try to open that aspect, whether we're able to move and supply our own pest risk assessments with the United States, which we've done to speed their own work along. And this is an important point. They want to work on their own pest risk assessment, so we're trying to nudge them with our own work, which we feel is quite strong, and we know we've got a good place to work from with the efficacy on sprout inhibitors, for example. So we are prioritizing that work. We're prioritizing the highest risk fields for soil sampling, because once we've done that, we believe that we can provide that information that will also help manage that risk question, right? We're back to that risk tolerance question. And then we are doing everything we can to get that information in place as quickly as we can. So it's very difficult to give a specific sort of critical path of timelines. It's multifaceted and multi-layered, but we are working as quickly as we can to drive to solutions earlier than one would anticipate if you waited and followed just a linear path. But again, it's very difficult to speculate with the United States. We do not control their decision-making, and we do not control when they have a comfort from a risk tolerance perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just before I go to Rob Henderson, you said 2023? Is that?
Yeah, I did. And I will underscore again, that is in the full process of the investigation. And as I said, we can advance work that can bring us to solution prior to 2023. But 2023 would be the fullness of all of the work that needs to be done. But we know that we can advance pieces of the scope in addition and in advance of that to try and unlock things prior to that date. But that is, if you played out the entire investigation that Gord was articulating, it would be 2023.
Thank you. Okay, Robert Henderson.
Thanks, Chair, and I appreciate a lot of the clarity and information that you've provided here. One of the things I'll just kind of go on a little bit about the decision to make CFIA imposing the restrictions on table potatoes to the United States. The Premier seems to be pretty adamant that that was a mistake. It should have been that the U.S. government put that on, and I'm still trying to get a better sense of what would be the extra difference, like you said, if it may be the information may not be back till 2023, would a U.S. imposed trade restriction extend that much longer? Would that be 2024, or what are we talking here? Maybe that's a question more for Mr. Rosser, but.
I'd probably defer to my colleagues, Mr. Chair, from the CFIA, but just to say, is certainly my understanding of it is that it is, as David and others have explained, advantageous that we control the timing of removing that, such that it can be removed very quickly once Americans agree to changes in the market access environment. If they instead control those levers, we have much less leverage to move quickly. That would be my understanding.
Rob?
Has that been communicated to the Premier and the potato industry and PEI? Because it seems like they seem to feel that the other option was a better route.
It's David here. Yes, that has been communicated clearly to the province's PEI and the PEI Potato Board and the National Potato Council as well. It has been a message that we have carried for quite a number of weeks at this point.
Rob?
To get back a little bit more on the issue around soil sampling, once again, we've gotten a bit of misinformation, or different information, I should say. Yesterday, the Department of Agriculture said soil sampling has been notified that it's been ceased. I've talked to the Potato Board last night, and they said, no, that's not the case. And you sort of indicated, I think maybe the first person that spoke indicated that they may be looking at some technology to permeate the frost to get the soil samples, to continue that soil sampling process, because it sounds like that's a long process, a lot of fields, a lot of samples. Can you kind of give us some sense of assurances that everything will continue on in the soil sampling process to get that information, regardless of weather? Because I'm quite confident technology exists. Or is there some reason why a frozen sample can't be thawed, and does it have an impact on the sample if it's thawed and dried and things of that nature?
Sure, I can take that question. So when you're soil sampling for quarantine purposes, the field, you do it on a grid-based field, right? A grid-based system, pardon me. And then you would selectively take soil of a certain amount from each of the collection points across the field until you've gotten a 5-pound sample per acre. That would be the standard. There are more intense ones that we do in the higher risk fields. And so it's a very physical activity that requires you to actually be shoveling into the soil points according to that grid pattern. And we can continue to do that until we can't get the shovel into the ground. So we have been looking at other mechanized systems. Are there tools that we could get that would be able to continue to operate on frozen ground, and then of course we have to work with the lab to make sure that if there is a tool that's available, would it produce the same kind of sample they need? Would it be possible? From my experience, when we do it by hand, it's much more better received by the growers, because they're worried about their biosecurity process, and if you move to a mechanized machinery size, some of the challenges you can have are really with access to the property, because they're worried about soil from one field or one farm being carried to their farm. So there are other considerations that come into play in doing it, and the method that we've been using for 21 years, not only for potato wort, but for PCN, the pest I mentioned earlier, and the same system the states use and other countries is really one that's based on using this grid pattern to get the most accurate information and the best results coming out of the field. So unfortunately, the limitation is when the ground is frozen solid, how are you going to get the sample? And because of the scale and scope of the area working on, it's a very large area. It's not something I think that you could really thaw out or break through without disrupting the process or creating more issues. But we're certainly looking at different options, and the public haven't been shy to contact me and offer suggestions. I've gotten suggestions from the United States even on how to get this done, because everybody wants this, the trade to resume, and everybody wants to see PI potatoes move back into the market and support the farmers that are being impacted.
Rob?
So then I'm still assuming that the soil samples are continuing as of today. They have not ceased. And I guess the other question I sort of had is, it was mentioned there a little bit about the potato wart management plan, and that it's a confidential document to a certain degree. Why isn't it something that's more open to, say, legislators here? And also, does the province of PEI, Department of Agriculture, and the PEI Potato Board have access to that? Do they know exactly what that potato wart management plan looks like, even though it may be kept in confidence?
Yeah, absolutely. Why we haven't posted it on the internet or handed it out to the public more freely is it actually does contain third-party information. It contains information about the sites where we'd be looking. It actually contains very detailed maps, and so we need to protect the privacy of others and And of course, anybody that unfortunately is dealing directly with this, they don't really want that advertised, right? They're concerned about their reputation, and we work discreetly with them to the best of our ability. And what we are looking at, though, is producing more of a public released version. So we'll sanitize it free of that, so that folks will be able to learn, the ins and outs of the program and have something to read. And we'll produce that in 2 official languages and be providing that. Now, yes, as when we work with the government of PI, we're working in the context of regulator to regulator, as you're aware. You have laws and regulations for plant protection and PI, and we have, we work in a confidential environment, and we share and we discuss it. And similarly, we have provided copies to the PI Potato Board, and I would be certain that we meet. We have met with them since 2020 and talked about every provision and every condition and the application. The members of the PI Potato Board, they're professionals, and they're looking out for the interests of the growers and PI, and we work closely with them. So they have a very, very strong understanding of it.
Rob?
Thanks for that. Well, it's good to know that at least that our province has it, and I don't necessarily need to see it myself personally. But the other, and this question might be a bit more for Mr. Rosser again, but the Premier made numerous comments yesterday regarding Minister Bibeau, and CFIA did not support his trip to Washington, D.C., yet the Minister in her interview today with CBC sort of suggested that she didn't get a call from the Premier to go on that, and also the Premier sort of mentioned that CFIA was showing no sense of urgency on this matter. Can you maybe respond a bit to that? Did the Premier actually call and invite Minister Bibeau to that trip to Washington, D.C. to help advance the cause of getting this opened?
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the question. We'll offer a few thoughts, and I can't speak to the comments that the Premier made in Washington. I'm not sure that I've actually seen the comments in question. I can say, as Minister Bibeau has many times, that this is her top priority. As I think had been indicated in earlier testimony, she's spoken multiple times to the Secretary of Agriculture, very, very engaged in the issue, and as are the Minister of Trade, Deputy Minister of Agriculture, the Prime Minister, have all been involved in advocacy and support of the work that CFIA is leading on plant health issues. I know that the Premier and the Minister have spoken on multiple occasions about this issue, not specifically aware of any invitation being extended.
Rob?
Okay, that's interesting. I guess my final question for this round, anyway, would be just regarding Puerto Rico. It was sort of mentioned in the presentation that Puerto Rico might be a possibility, or maybe it was the minister on her CBC interview today, but is there any difference with Puerto Rico being a territory when it comes to the process that you would have to do to get that border open sooner rather than with the whole U.S.? I guess I'm just wondering what flexibility is there. Does it mean that a few less soil samples might have to be done to trigger that border opening, or just what has to be done, or is there any difference? If there's no difference, that solves that answer or question. Sorry.
David? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the question. And when it comes to Puerto Rico, the United States doesn't consider it any different than the continental U.S., and that would apply to all U.S. protectorates, if that's the right term to use. And we have had conversations with them, and I have myself corresponded with USDA APHIS to indicate that we believe that our risk mitigation measures in PEI are such that product to Puerto Rico would not pose a risk to the continental part of the United States, but they continue to indicate that that is a market that is not open to us. Despite questions around climatic conditions are different and do not support, in our view, the propagation of potato wart. With bagged potatoes that are washed and brushed, clean, sprout inhibited, et cetera, that the risk is negligible. But again, as I mentioned earlier, importing countries, are able to set their own risk tolerance, and for the United States, they believe there is a risk there, and so it is, as you said, it is close to us at this point.
Thank you. Hannah Bell?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the scope and the scale of the presentations today. I note with interest the comments from your opening remarks, Dr. Mithani, regarding the hope for a renewed commitment by PEI representatives to work more collaboratively, it's Friday, in the pursuit of shared objectives. And I think certainly the legislators here are mindful that the work that we're doing is to try and get to the truth of the matter, which is, we're talking about something which is science-based, is particularly important. So the scope of the presentations today are a big piece of that. So my asks initially is I have asked if we could have a copy of the technical presentation shared to the members of the committee for reference. It's a lot to take in at the time, and obviously we want to make sure that anything that we speak about on an ongoing matter, we're using that as a reference point. So that would be hugely valuable to the work of this committee. And the second piece on that one is I would echo my colleagues' remarks regarding the challenges that we've been facing about speaking about a plan that we're not able to see. I do appreciate the clarification that the level of partnership between all levels of government and industry, including the Potato Board, the government of PEI, the Department of Agriculture and CFIA, as well as the USA partners in working from the same plan. And perhaps, whilst I understand, the difficulties in wanting to protect confidentiality, what's important is the operationalization of that. How does that look on the ongoing management? Because when you speak about where the tip points, where the challenges are in this, it really does come down to those roles and responsibilities. How are those partners communicating with each other and with the growers and the industry? So I would really reinforce the request that a redacted or even a portion of that plan which reflects the operational nature and the roles and responsibilities would be hugely valuable. I think valuable both from the perspective of the legislators here, but also from the community that's trying to get a handle on what is such a complex issue. Would that be something that you would consider making a priority to assist the communication?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I would absolutely make a commitment that the technical presentation that Gord has just put up will be shared with the committee members, and also the fact that we will look at the long-term management plan, try and redact information, and at least provide you with a with a copy where there isn't any confidential or business information. We will do that as a priority.
Hannah?
Thank you, Dr. Mithani. That's very much appreciated. That clarity is something that I think we're all trying to strive for. One of the pieces around this is unfortunately that there have been maybe not such clear communications from different partners, and personally I feel that that is hindering us being able to take action which is supportive of the industry. Obviously I personally am very shocked at hearing that almost half of all the acreage in production is encompassed within the management plan. The scope and the scale of the work that has obviously been ongoing for 21 years, we've sort of known that it was there from the original finding and the work that went then, and then the ongoing piece. But to hear that there's 35,000 acres, that's half of the production of the province, and that scale obviously speaks to then the impact. I do really also appreciate the subtlety of talking about risk tolerance, because what I'm understanding from the presentation today is that we've reached a tipping point. That the question of why didn't this happen before, when we had those outbreaks in 2012 or 2014 or last year, why didn't we get this level of response, seems to be more about reaching a tipping point where the tolerance has been exceeded. And my question, I guess, to whoever may feel best placed to answer it is that a result of not being able to actually implement that plan as effectively as it could have been? Are there things that we overall have not been able to do to actually address the concerns that are inherent in the mitigation plan and therefore have tipped?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would say that I'll pass it over to Gordon and maybe David to respond more fully. But I would say that the long-term management plan has been in place. We have had conversations with the U.S. throughout the 21 years. We have been working with them, and therefore, if there were any modifications or changes that would have been required, we would have known. We have been very transparent also with the potato board, with the PEI government, and as well, I know that our staff that are on the ground in PEI have really solid relationships with the growers, and that information has been disseminated, perhaps not from a province-wide perspective, but certainly with the producers and growers that have been impacted. But I'll ask Gord to further elaborate on that.
Great, thank you. I just want to make one clarification. So I understand from the agricultural stats that that there are 350,000 acres of PEI which are devoted to potato production. Of those, 85,000 acres are used annually. So it's about a third, basically, because everybody enjoys a 3 or 4 year crop rotation. So it's actually a much lower percentage. It would be, the acres that are regulated would be of 350,000 acres, not that annual amount. In terms of the tipping point, I think the overall tipping point is when potato wort was detected in the context of seed potato farms. That really activates another pathway, which is the movement of seed potatoes and the planting of those seed potatoes that could potentially be infested. And that's where you now have another pathway that you need to consider regulating stronger, perhaps, or regulating differently. And that's why we reach out to countries like the Netherlands and continue to work with the United States to see, what can we change that would further improve or reduce the likelihood of any potential spread on a farm. And I think that's where, we come back to the discussions that I've had with the province of PEI in removing index fields from not only potato production, but, ideally remove them from agricultural production. And that just takes one more element that, you can remove away as a potential risk factor. Those fields that, if you're even using for other agricultural production, you're still moving equipment around, you're still perhaps moving soil, and there still is, a much less risky scenario on human-mediated movement, but it's still there. So I think in tightening the program, these are the kinds of factors we'll look at. You can make changes. I think the program is very adequate now, and I think it's addressing the risks that we've identified and is consistent with the science. But there's always the opportunity to go back to investigation like we're doing and look to see if you can tighten it up a little bit more.
Hannah?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the clarification. Yeah, the number of numbers today, and it was about the number of acres that are in production in any given year versus the total. So thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of, we did hear this yesterday from the department when they were in about the risk is obviously not only to our entire industry, but then beyond that, we're talking about root crops, about strawberry plants, about sod field, and it is about agricultural production in those index fields. And so, planting trees is one of the lowest risk pieces in terms of potentially taking fields permanently out of production, and that feels. I know for an individual farmer, that's a really difficult decision or conversation to have, but we have to look at this in the context of saving the industry, and that maybe that is, what the next stages that come in terms of where we go with that mitigation plan. If it no longer meets the conditions that we need to meet to be able to open those borders again, then we as an industry are going to need to be prepared to make some choices. And our provincial partners on this end of it need to then be a partner in terms of how we do that to make it work, whether that's compensation or other programs of support. Something that had been mentioned, change of topic, but relevant, was that there is a ministerial order in place, or ministerial orders in place, and one of them that had been mentioned in the opening remarks was regarding restrictions for Canadian transportation of PEI potatoes. We've been hearing from industry that they're shipping potatoes across Canada, and that's an example of why our potatoes are still safe and obviously good as product. Are there actually restrictions currently on PEI potatoes being moved across within the Canadian market under ministerial order?
David, do you want to take that one?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, the purpose of the ministerial order is really one to set conditions, right? So it's not a prohibition. It just sets a series of conditions to ensure that we can move PEI product, fresh potatoes, processing potatoes across the country, right? And so, you would be looking at, if you were moving bulk potatoes, for example, to a processor to process into frozen products, fries, what have you, then there would be conditions on that processor to have in place an appropriate mitigation strategy in terms of what we would call a compliance agreement to ensure that they're managing the culls from that processing and wastewater, et cetera, in an appropriate manner, not so as not to create a risk or to spread a risk. But within those conditions, product is quite able to move. These are not unusual conditions. The reason for that part of the ministerial order was simply to provide us with regulatory tools to manage that risk. So again, back to an approach to mitigate risk in the movement of products, but not to prohibit the movement of products.
Hannah?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you. We obviously have from industry and from government, and growers, confidence that the potatoes, the regulations that are already in place in terms of sort of dry brushing, washing, packaging, and so on, kind of meet or exceed those regular. But I appreciate that it's the regulatory framework that kind of helps reinforce. And there's a demonstration of goodwill in putting that order there, which I also recognize in terms of how you address that perceived risk. But it does raise the question that I asked yesterday and was told to ask you, which was around the contractual obligations that we know, for instance, between CFIA and the province regarding washing and wastewater and that level of visual inspection. What requirements are they to manage wastewater and waste product from the cleaning process as part of the potential risk factor in potato wart?
I'll start with the response to that question. Yeah, so, what if, when all the potatoes converge, into a facility such as a processing plant where they're going to be washed, then obviously the wash water is going to have soil in it. If the potatoes are culled, for example, if they have mechanical damage or they don't meet the quality expectations of the facility or the contract, then you have some products that get diverted or some peels if they're going to be peeled. So you end up with wastewater and you end up with products as a result of the processing that you need to dispose of. So those facilities are put under a compliance agreement, and there's certain options that are available for them. You could deep bury, you could incinerate, you could have a system that brings it down into the municipal waste system so that it's diverted away from any agricultural land. So there's a variety of different tools that a facility would have, and the CFIA, working with that regulated party, will assess them. Sometimes if they have a particular system that would be treating them, for example, through heat or thermal treatment, whatever, then we can assess that as well to see if it would effectively mitigate that risk. Now, this is a very common practice in plant protection. It's one that most major facilities in Canada already have in place. Because from time to time there's a desire to, say, import potatoes from the United States, and we have similar concerns, obviously. And so these facilities have regularly, participated in the program and have valid, what we call compliance agreement, which basically is the agreement between the grower and looking at the practices they have in place that meet the objective of mitigating the risk and the disposal of wastewater and any residue coming from the potatoes are two key pathways that need to be addressed because they are pathways of potential spread of potato wart resting spores.
Hannah?
So if that process is being subcontracted to the province as part of in terms of the overall application or of the long-term plan, where is the oversight that those required standards are being met with the wastewater disposal, for example?
I think in any program, you still have CFI oversight, and I apologize, I'm not aware of the dialogue between the CFI regional office and perhaps the plants. That's the operational activities they have, so I don't have any fine details on that. But the facility would be put under an audit program, and if I hear you correctly, we are considering the work that could happen between the province and the CFI to achieve that goal, but I don't have any details on that personally.
Okay, just one more. Okay. And I guess my last question is regarding you'd spoken earlier about fields potentially being taken permanently out of production. Is something we spoke about with the province, as I said earlier, as well. Is that something that you've already spoken to the province about as a potential route to reduce the risk, the perceived risk that's in this current crisis?
Yes, I've had discussions this year on it, and I've had discussions in previous years on it. It's a really good phytosanitary practice to remove any regulated land, obviously from presenting that risk farther. But yeah, we've had those discussions, and they talked about a variety of different options that they might have, and just wanted to get some feedback on what that would mean. And I think one of the interesting things that would be very receptive is this is a common practice in regulatory programs. And in fact, if you look at some of the land that's been released, say in New York State for a PCN, a lot of that land was removed from agricultural production. Of course, they probably built cities or shopping centers or some sort of industrial facility over them. But it was a very effective way of removing that risk from the situation.
Thanks, Corey.
Thank you, Hannah. We'll go to Darlene Compton now.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone, for coming to us via Zoom. It was something that we thought was very important for you to hear from our committee about our concerns, as well as those of everyone else, I guess, on PEI. The more I hear, I think the more confused I'm getting about some of the decisions that are made. And the first one would be, you talk about putting the order on ourselves, and it puts us in a better position moving forward. But yet, in the same answer you said, the U.S. has to agree before we can basically change it or lift the order. And by placing the order on ourselves, haven't we blocked any option for trade litigation through the free trade agreement?
David, go ahead. Sorry. Thanks. David?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. So I'll attempt to sort of break it down into a couple of pieces. So what we mean by being able to take down the order ourselves, it amounts to our ability to demonstrate the science pieces to the United States, so the Department of Agriculture in the United States, that we can demonstrate that we have assessed the risk, that we're able to mitigate the risk. This will satisfy the question around their risk tolerance. And once they agree that they agree that we have done what they've asked, that we can satisfy those questions, that they have completed the work that they are looking to complete themselves, and that they are ready to resume trade with us, it allows us to resume that trade very quickly with our own order. So we can take that order down, as I said earlier, we can do that in a single day. But with the United States federal order, we would not be able to do that quickly, which would mean we would have agreement that trade could resume based on the technical discussions, but we wouldn't have an ability to have that trade actually take place as quickly as we can when we hold those tools in our hands. For your second part of your question around the trade question, I will turn to my colleague, Tom Rosser from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. He may have a better perspective on that than I do. So Tom?
Mr. Chair, the only thing I would add to David's comment is that, if ever we thought it was in our interest that this be, that the ministerial order be replaced by a federal order, minister has the ability to withdraw the ministerial order at any time.
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. I guess that's an answer that explains something to us, but I'm not quite sure. Again, about we're talking about the report maybe not being completed till 2023. I'm wondering if CFIA, do you feel that you're under-resourced as far as being able to handle this crisis?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's important to understand that it's the sampling, the analysis that takes time. It is not about the resources. I would really say that, you know, we are doing the best that we can. We are collecting the samples that we have to. And I also think, to your previous question, I'd like for us to be able to make a distinction between the ministerial order and the temporary suspension. I think it's important that, you know, with the ministerial order, there were conditions that were put in. With the voluntary suspension, what this really allows us to do, it allows us to be then able to take off the ministerial order or to modify it once we've had the conversation with the U.S. Even if we get to a stage where the U.S. is ready and they are satisfied with the requirements that we've put in place, for them to take off a federal order would be very, very difficult, and we would be at their mercy. We went back and looked at many federal orders that they had put in place previously and found that there weren't very many where they were able to take those orders off. So, I mean, I think that the whole issue of federal order and the suspension is an important one. It was a practical solution of moving forward. And I would say that the technical discussions that are happening are equally as important. So right now we are really preoccupied with the issue of sprout inhibitors, the fact that we want efficacy data to show them that basically the way we have been able to wash, clean, use sprout inhibitors is sufficient to, based on our assessment, that the risk is negligible. And so those are the discussions that become important. The fact that we've got a long investigation is really as a result of the sampling that we've got to do, the testing that we've got to do, that does take its time.
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. So you mentioned earlier that you're pulling out all the stops, and I'm just wondering what additional resources you're putting in place, whether it's financial or time resources or human resources to get us where we need to be and have trade happen again. What additionally are you doing?
So at this moment thank you, Chair, for the question. So at this moment, we are in a situation where we have a dedicated team that is looking at the whole issue of potato wart. So we have a team that is looking at it from the international perspective with the technical discussions that are happening with the U.S. and even other sort of markets as well. Obviously, there is another team that is looking at the long-term management plan and working on the ground with PEI in terms of what else needs to be done. The consultation and the coordination with the potato board with PEI as well. We've got another team that is really looking at risk pathways, looking at the science around what kind of scientific data do we require in order for us to move and advance these conversations with the U.S., in an effort to resume trade. So there are a number of things that we are looking at in terms of the potato wart issue. I don't know whether David, you would want to expand on that, or perhaps Sylvie can expand on that.
Yes, Siddika, I could expand on that. I think in terms of resources, so we've been working with our provincial colleagues around, for example, identifying additional individuals who could help with soil sampling. And the additional individuals have been brought on board to do soil sampling in order to get as much soil samples into the 5-pound bags that are collected as possible before freeze up. So that would be an example of where we've got additional resources. As Dr. Mithani mentioned, we have a team that is a robust team that covers all parts of the agency as well as other government partners, in order to look at all aspects, so a multi-pronged approach, aspects with the U.S., aspects around science, trade advocacy, et cetera. We had talked earlier about our colleagues at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and their government industry working group. Well, within that working group, we have a sub-working group that we are partnering or working collaboratively with the province of PEI and the PEI Potato Board to look at solutions and to look at elements that we need to move forward on. You mentioned planting trees. Well, that is one that our colleagues from the province had raised with us. So there are all of these approaches that are being put in place, and full team, I can tell you, my full team is on this every day, all day, 7 days a week, and we have been doing that since the beginning of October. And we're, as the president has said, we are pulling out all stops to get this resolved as fast as is possible and reasonable in these circumstances.
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. I guess what we're wondering here as Islanders is what we can do provincially, whether farmers could self-test. Can we get to that point? Can we, as the province, arrange provincial oversight on this? And I mean, it's wonderful to hear that you've got a number of people working on this, and I would hope that they're, I guess, senior officials who are very well aware of the file. I'm just wondering how many people would be new to the file and, understand the importance of the file and have the experience that are needed to deal with the war crisis.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, I would say that we cannot underestimate the amount of collaboration and consultation we are doing with the potato board, with the PEI potato board, with the province, with all the working groups that we've got established. So this is not just about CFIA or the federal government. This is really a Team Canada approach. And we've been looking at this very, very carefully. And maybe, Sylvie, you might want to interject here and talk a little bit about some of the work that is being done in terms of collaboration with other partners.
Thank you, Chair. Just to emphasize, it is a Team Canada approach, and there's definitely collaboration that's required at all levels because we all have different tools in our toolbox to be able to improve the situation. So that's why we're working very closely with the province as well as the PEI Potato Board. I wanted to touch briefly on an issue that hasn't come up yet, and that's the efforts that we've been putting into opening other markets while we continue on reopening the border in the United States. So based on a number of expressions of interest from other markets, we've been engaging with our counterparts in other countries, working with our embassies abroad and our market access colleagues within the CFIA. So the number of countries we're working with to open not only to table stock potatoes, but also potentially to seed potatoes. And those include countries like Uruguay and Jamaica and others. And so I think that was an important point to bring to bear as part of this discussion today.
I might just add, if I can quickly, that beyond the efforts CFIA is already described, as I think has already been alluded to, I mean, this is Mr. Bibeau's top priority. We at Agriculture Canada, whether on the science side, on our international affairs group, our policy groups elsewhere, are mobilizing whatever resources we can to support the broader effort. As I know our colleagues at Global Affairs, at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, at our network of consulates across the United States and our missions around the world.
Thank you. We're going to go to Peter Bevan-Baker.
Thank you, Chair. First, I want to thank you for your time and presentation this afternoon. One of the phrases we've heard repeatedly, and Minister Bibeau said it this morning in her interview, and we heard the Premier say it the other day, is that the management plan is working. And by that, what they mean is, I take it anyway, that we are detecting outbreaks as they occur. But a management plan is working in that respect only if the goal of that management plan is to have enough assurances to certify for exports. The plan is not working if our goal is to contain the pathogen and ultimately to eradicate it from Prince Edward Island. So I wonder, a general question, first of all, what do you view as the main goal of the potato wart domestic long-term management plan? Is it to eradicate the disease and contain it, or is it just to meet the export requirements of our partners?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, I would say that an important point with regard to the long-term management plan is that it isn't an eradication plan, but it's one about preventing and controlling the spread. As a regulator, it is in our mandate to ensure, based on the Plant Protection Act, that we do prevent and control spread. So that is ultimately, foundationally, the rationale for the long-term management plan. And perhaps Sylvie can talk a little bit about, some of the aspects, or maybe David can.
David, maybe do you want to take that one?
Thank you. Yeah, no, sorry, just had a little trouble with my mic there. Yeah, I think, President Mithani is correct. Like, the goal of the plan really is one of prevention and containment. And as Gord has pointed out in his presentation, and you may have seen even from Dr. Carolyn Sanford yesterday, eradicating potato wart is a very, very challenging thing to do. Some might even say it's almost impossible to do. But the goal to prevent and to contain, and since the process we use around the index fields and the investigations is all designed to identify where we have the problem, to contain that problem. And the containment of that problem allows us to trade, allows us to use the other risk mitigating measures in trade, and it has been successful. And we have faith in the long-term management plan. But of course, as with many things, as you learn more, you may need to evolve it, you may need to tweak it a wee bit. And as we've been moving along, we have done those things. So the goal of the plan really is a plan that enables the collaboration between the province, the industry associations, and the practitioners themselves, and CFIA as the regulator, to identify when the problem is there, and then to take action to manage the problem. And that really is the goal at the end of the day. Again, back to managing risk against a reasonable risk tolerance that supports trade of what are high quality potatoes.
Peter?
Thank you. You used the phrase that you have faith in our plan, but clearly our trade partners do not share that. They apparently have lost faith in this plan. And that's the problem here, is that we do not hold the cards. We do not feel like, and I believe, nor are we, the people in charge here. The US is still demanding particular things from us, and that was one of the slides at the very end of the presentation there, which I look forward to having time to look at properly. But it strikes me that what we feel about the plan is almost immaterial. We still have to meet the US demands. So what are we doing which will meet these US demands and open this border before, as you said, perhaps 2023? I mean, that's absolutely catastrophic for this province if that is the case.
So I would look at this from a slightly different perspective. And that perspective would be the US has not rejected the plan. In fact, they are looking for the outcome of the exercise of the plan in the 2 investigations we have, as well as finishing the work from the 2020 investigation. So I would say that maybe they've put a pause against their risk tolerance, but the outcome of the elements that are built into the long-term plan is the evidentiary base that will provide us with that ability to reopen the market with the United States. So I think this focus on whether the plan is this most amazing thing or whether it's a weakness is 2 extremes that do not reflect the reality of the science-based conversations between CFIA and APHIS. We are focused on the tool, which is the plan, as one element of providing that risk mitigation measures and the satisfaction of what we're doing to demonstrate to the United States that we know where the pest is and we know where it isn't. And that is the foundational root within the elements of the plan. Thank you.
Peter?
I'm interested in finding out a little bit more about the province's role and responsibilities when it comes to the management plan. And Dr. Mithani said at the beginning that there were 4 Canadian partners involved in the development of the long-term management plan, 2 of them being provincial, the Potato Board here and the Provincial Department of Agriculture. I'm really interested to know, I mean, my understanding is that the federal government has jurisdiction over trade measures and over quarantine issues, and that the provincial government has jurisdiction over land use. But when it comes to the actual development of the plan, and any times that that plan is changed, and we've learned today and heard yesterday that the plan has been updated on a number of occasions over the 20 years, what role does the provincial government play in the development of that plan and in any changes that are made?
That question, I'll turn to Gord, who has a bit better of a historical perspective on that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I can say that, you know, in respect to the work in PEI, we have a working group that has existed for a long time, where those 4 partners sit at the table, and collectively we, you know, we'll go through the situation and compare it to whatever event we need to compare it against, and I'm assuming that actually went all the way back to 2000, so that cooperation and collaboration was always there. Now it is a management plan that resides with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and it is a pest mitigation plan it's established under the Plant Protection Act and regulations, and the tools like the notices I showed you were tools that are related to that legislation. But that doesn't limit the ability for the province to develop a plan in addition to that, or to supplement that plan. As you're quite aware, there is provincial legislation that can enable them to do certain activities, and working on reviewing the plan, that's something I think we're going to talk about. You know, what changes could the province do, and how could they contribute more to the outcome of ensuring that this doesn't happen again, and trade disruptions are minimized. So there's certainly room there for dialogue, and we might find that there are certain aspects that would be quite useful for enhancing the plan. We've done that situation with other governments, for example, with Central Saanich in British Columbia, where we have a ministerial order in place for PCN. The provincial government also put in their regulations on top of that to ensure that we mirrored the purpose and the scope of the plan. So we certainly can work with officials as we have been doing, and see if there is room for different land control options, or a way of dividing the work within you know, the scope of what regulators do. We can certainly provide oversight. We can certainly look at these options, and you know, with a view to making a stronger plan and ensure that every regulatory partner is you know, providing their best role they can.
Thank you. Now, I know we're about 10 minutes over our allotted time. I know Peter has one more question, and Mr. Hammerland has a question as well. I don't know if our guests are able to perhaps stick around to answer those questions or not, if you have a few more minutes. Okay, we'll go to Peter then.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. One of the challenges as a provincial legislator is that we've heard conflicting stories here. Yesterday we were told quite clearly that no indexed fields had been planted with potatoes in the last 20 years. We heard in your presentation today that those fields are regularly and consistently replanted with potatoes, and that makes working through this very difficult. Can you well, I guess my question is, I have one more question, so I want to make it good. Has the CFIA been actively advocating and lobbying the provincial government to take index fields out of potato production permanently?
Gord, do you have any information about that?
You know, I go back to the management plan, and we work together to build it. And yes, it's true that it's a plan that assesses the risk presented by the field, and it tests it year over year. And under strict conditions, potato production can return quite successfully to these regulated fields. In the context of those discussions, we're always looking at different options, and certainly one is removing the land from potato production or shifting it to another agricultural crop or transforming the land into something that isn't in the agricultural base. And that's obviously, if you look into what we did in Central Saanich example, that occurred quite fluidly there as industry adapted to a changing environment and the best way that they want to use the land. I wouldn't say we've been advocating, we've been talking about it, and the province has offered some interesting options. The tree planting option for one, which if I recall correctly, in Central Saanich, they did plant Christmas trees, for example, so you're not disturbing the soil, you're planting a crop that's above the soil, which minimizes the risk, and obviously you're going to have a ground crop or some sort of carpet of plants under there that would help embed the plant or the fungus to the soil, and by doing that you're removing its possibility of having a host to continue its life, and thus it should naturally die out quite rapidly, I'm sure. So it is part of the conversation, and I would look forward to those discussions, or look forward to other ways of using that land that would minimize any risk. Certainly all those options are there, but I think the province has agreed that the plan is working, and we continue to monitor it, so I'm quite comfortable where the plan is, if they want to continue under those strict provisions or if they want to transform it. When you look at a similar program for PCN, and I know I keep turning back to that as a good example because it's an equally difficult file to work with. And in that case, we have what's called the PCN guidelines, and I can certainly provide a copy of that or a link to that. And you can see the efforts of Canada and the United States and the development of the programs to continue safe trade in potatoes with another soil-borne pest. In that case, it's a nematode, not a fungus. And quite clearly, you'll see in Section 9 that there is a condition for removing agricultural land from production and transforming agricultural land to produce other things. It is definitely an option that is something that could be applied, and it would be effective in mitigating the concerns further.
Thank you. Okay, so our final question, we're going to go to Mr. Hammerland.
Thank you, Chair. My burning question was just answered, or asked and answered, but I had another question. To what extent does CFIA have the authority to dictate what actually grows there? Like, could you, for instance, ask that only resistant potatoes be planted? Or can you dictate that no potatoes of any kind be grown on the land?
That's a very good and challenging question. So again, I'll turn back to my PCN example. So in Central Saanich, PCN was discovered in the 60s there, and they've had various programs that existed through the decades. And in 1980 and 1982, there was a huge program shift, and we established a ministerial order, and we also published 2 federal sets of regulations. For that pest, the host is potatoes, tomatoes, and eggplant. And we actually produced those regulations to prohibit the planting of those hosts in the fields, effectively creating a zone which would not have potato production or eggplant or tomato production as an effort to eradicate it. And that is a definitely true eradication program. So it is in the ability for those kinds of decisions to be made, but I believe you would need a new legislative tool to give you that authority. The current authority we have is what supports the long-term management plan. And collectively, the decisions were similar to what you'd find in the PCN guidelines with the United States, to continue to use land where the grower is desiring to continue to produce potatoes under those strict programs. But when I look to other programs, such as the Netherlands and the reliance on things like highly resistant potato crops, it's already an option in our program. But working with those growers and looking at that as an option is something we're going to do over the next while, because it definitely is a different way to suppress the population and remove it from being a concern. And so you could end up in a situation where you take the high-risk fields and you basically mandate a program under a written authorization where the grower would have to use a selection of potato varieties that would not allow the population even that little opportunity increase. And then you can assess that over time, and perhaps with the population eliminated or the concerns eliminated in those fields, you could return to susceptible varieties. So that's definitely a phytosanitary program and option that we have to consider.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to all of our guests as well. Dr. Mithani, I don't know if you have any perhaps closing remarks, if there's anything you wanted to share before we let you all go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. All I'd like to say is that I want to thank you for the time that you've given us to provide you an overview of the potato wort issue, and I'm really hoping that going forward that we will be able to work together as Team Canada in trying to address some of these issues, because I think that CFIA cannot do it alone, and the collaboration with both the province as well as the potato growers and the potato board is extremely critical in this very trying time. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank you all for appearing on very short notice and answering our questions today. All right, we're just going to recess for a moment and before we finish with our agenda. Thank you. All right, we'll finish up. Do we have any new business?
What remains on the agenda relating to this topic, Chair?
We have the potato board in the new year, correct?
Yes.
And
we also have some invitations out to like Federation of Agriculture. I don't have the extensive list, but I can forward it along following the meeting.
Yeah. So we're looking at the new year. It's been a very busy week.
It has. It has. Okay, so no further new business. Oh, sorry, Ola?
Did we get enough questions answered from CFIA? I mean, would it be worthwhile, for instance, to ask the local rep CFI to I'm just asking the question now.
Might be.
Perhaps it might be worthwhile. I don't think we probably wouldn't get these individuals back again, I'm assuming.
Yeah, no, I was speaking about
the local.
About the local honchos.
Perhaps we can look into that.
Sure. Like to send an invitation?
Sure. Yeah. Is that all right with the committee? All right. Let's do it. Good. All right. No further new business. Motion to adjourn. Sure. Thank you. Merry Christmas.